Dr. Amanda Foster had examined thousands of Victorian and Edwardian photographs during her career as a forensic photograph analyst at the Library of Congress, but the family portrait that arrived in her office on a humid August morning in 2024 disturbed her in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. The photograph, donated by the estate of Helen Richardson from Richmond, Virginia, showed a family of 5 posed in their parlor sometime around 1910. The image appeared conventional at first glance. A father standing behind a seated mother, 3 children arranged around them. The furniture was typical of the era: heavy oak chairs, ornate wallpaper, a potted fern in the corner. Everyone wore their Sunday best, the children in starched collars and the parents in formal attire. But something about the composition felt wrong. Amanda adjusted her examination lamp and studied each face carefully. The father stared grimly at the camera, typical of long exposure times that made smiling difficult. The mother's expression was neutral, almost blank. 2 of the children, a boy of perhaps 12 and a girl of 8, looked solemn and uncomfortable. But the middle child, a girl who appeared to be about 10 years old, was smiling. That smile was what disturbed Amanda. It wasn't the forced, awkward smile common in early photographs. It was too wide, too fixed, and somehow lifeless. The girl's eyes seemed unfocused, staring past the camera rather than at it. Her posture was stiff in a way that went beyond the rigid formality of the era. Amanda reached for her magnifying equipment. There was something fundamentally wrong with this child's appearance, and she needed to understand what her instincts were telling her. After 3 hours of high-resolution scanning and detailed examination, Amanda called Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic pathologist who occasionally consulted on historical medical mysteries. He arrived at her office that evening, his expertise in post-mortem examination making him uniquely qualified to assess what Amanda suspected but couldn't quite believe. They stood together before her computer screen, examining the digitized image at maximum magnification. Chen focused immediately on the smiling girl, his expression growing increasingly serious as he studied her features. "Look at her skin tone," he said quietly, pointing to enhanced sections of the image. Even accounting for the photographic limitations of 1910, there's a distinct pallor here, a waxy quality that's different from the other family members. And her eyes, he zoomed in further. There's no catchlight, no reflection. In every other person in this photograph, you can see tiny highlights in their eyes from the photographer's lighting. In this child, there's nothing. The eyes are completely flat. Amanda felt a chill despite the warm office. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Chen nodded slowly. Postmortem photography was still practiced in 1910, though it was declining. But this isn't a typical memorial portrait where the deceased is obviously laid out or positioned peacefully. Someone went to great lengths to make this child appear alive. Look at her positioning. She's propped up, supported. The smile was probably created manually, arranging the facial muscles. He pulled up comparative images from his database of documented post-mortem photographs. See these characteristics? The unnatural rigidity, the skin texture, the absence of any micro-expressions or muscle tension that living people unconsciously display. This child was already deceased when this photograph was taken. Amanda studied the image with new horror. But why? Why would a family photograph their dead child posed as if she were alive, smiling among her living siblings? Amanda spent the following week researching the Richardson family of Richmond, Virginia. The photograph had come with minimal documentation, just a handwritten note identifying it as the Richardson family, circa 1910, and a list of names: Father Richard Richardson, Mother Dorothy Richardson, and children Michael, Elizabeth, and Sarah. Census records from 1910 confirmed the family's existence. Richard Richardson, age 38, worked as a bank manager. Dorothy was listed as 35. 3 children were recorded: Michael, age 12, Elizabeth, age 10, and Sarah, age 8. The family lived in a substantial house on Grove Avenue in Richmond's Fan District, an affluent neighborhood. But when Amanda searched the 1920 census, only 4 family members appeared: Richard, Dorothy, Michael, and Sarah. Elizabeth was gone. Amanda's hands trembled as she accessed Virginia death records from the 1910s. She found it. Elizabeth Richardson. Died March 15, 1910, age 10 years. Cause of death listed as scarlet fever. The death certificate was signed by Dr. James Whitmore, a prominent Richmond physician. Amanda cross-referenced the date with photographic studios operating in Richmond at that time. She found an invoice from Hamilton Portrait Studio dated March 17, 1910, 2 days after Elizabeth's death, for a family portrait session and special arrangements. The cost was substantial, nearly 3 times the normal rate for a family photograph. She contacted the Virginia Historical Society, which maintained records of local photography studios. Within days, she received a response that included a brief biography of Thomas Hamilton, who had operated the portrait studio from 1895 to 1925. One line caught her attention. Hamilton was known for his sensitive handling of memorial portraits and postmortem photography, though this practice declined significantly after 1910. Dr. Chen used his medical credentials to access archived physician records at the Medical College of Virginia, now part of Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. James Whitmore's papers had been donated to the medical school's historical collection in 1952, including patient logs and correspondence from his 40-year practice. Amanda and Chen spent a cold morning in the archive room, carefully reviewing Whitmore's records from early 1910. They found Elizabeth Richardson's file, noting the scarlet fever diagnosis and the swift progression of her illness. Whitmore had been called to the Richardson home on March 12, 1910. Elizabeth died 3 days later despite his treatment, but attached to Elizabeth's medical file was something unexpected. A letter from Dorothy Richardson to Dr. Whitmore, dated March 16, 1910, one day after her daughter's death and one day before the photograph was taken. Chen read it aloud, his voice subdued. Dear Dr. Whitmore, I am writing to request your professional assistance with a matter of utmost delicacy. As you know, our beloved Elizabeth passed yesterday, and the grief has been unbearable. My husband insists we must have a final family portrait. Not a memorial portrait, but one where Elizabeth appears as she was in life, smiling and present with us. He cannot accept her absence. I am begging you to help us prepare Elizabeth, so that Mr. Hamilton can create this photograph. My husband's mental state is fragile, and I fear what might happen if we cannot grant him this one final image of our complete family. Please come to our home tomorrow morning before the photographer arrives. Amanda sat back, processing this revelation. The father couldn't accept his daughter's death. He demanded a photograph that showed his family intact, with Elizabeth appearing alive. Chen found Dr. Whitmore's response in his correspondence file. I have agreed to Mrs. Richardson's request, though I do so with great reluctance and only out of concern for Mr. Richardson's mental health. I will prepare the child's body as requested. Amanda tracked down descendants of Thomas Hamilton, the photographer who had taken the Richardson family portrait. His great-grandson, Edward Hamilton, lived in Alexandria and possessed his ancestors' business records and personal journals. Edward welcomed Amanda and Chen into his home, a modest townhouse filled with antique cameras and framed photographs spanning generations. He retrieved a leather-bound journal from a glass cabinet, Thomas Hamilton's personal diary from 1908 to 1912. I've read this many times, Edward said quietly. March 1910 was particularly difficult for my great-grandfather. He wrote extensively about the Richardson portrait. Amanda carefully turned to the entry dated March 17, 1910. Hamilton's handwriting was precise, his words choosing measured but clearly troubled. Today I undertook the most disturbing commission of my career. The Richardson family requested a portrait, not a memorial portrait, but a family portrait with their recently deceased daughter positioned as though alive. Mr. Richardson insisted the child must appear to be smiling, must look natural and present. Mrs. Richardson wept throughout the session while maintaining a composed facade. The two surviving children were clearly traumatized, forced to sit beside their dead sister for nearly 30 minutes during the exposure. Dr. Whitmore had prepared the body admirably. The cosmetics, the positioning, even the manipulation of facial muscles to create the appearance of a smile, but no amount of technical skill could hide the fundamental wrongness of what we were doing. The child's eyes were open, but seeing nothing. Her skin had the texture of wax, despite the powder and rouge. Mr. Richardson stood behind his family, his hand on his wife's shoulder, and stared at the camera with an expression I can only describe as desperate madness. I have taken many memorial portraits, dignified, peaceful images that help families grieve. This was something else entirely. This was denial of death itself, an attempt to preserve through photography what could not be preserved in life. I pray I never receive such a request again. Amanda contacted Dr. Lisa Morrison, a psychiatrist who specialized in historical trauma and grief psychology. Together, they began investigating what had happened to the Richardson family after March 1910, trying to understand the psychological impact of the disturbing photograph session. Hospital records from Richmond reveal that Richard Richardson had been admitted to Tucker Pavilion, the psychiatric facility at the Medical College of Virginia, in October 1910, 7 months after Elizabeth's death and the photograph. His admission notes described severe melancholia, delusional thinking regarding deceased daughter, inability to accept reality of child's death. Richard spent 6 months in institutional care. Treatment records indicated he had become obsessed with the family photograph, claiming that Elizabeth was still alive in the image, that if he looked at it long enough, he could bring her back. Dorothy Richardson had finally hidden the photograph, which precipitated a violent episode that led to his hospitalization. Dr. Morrison reviewed the historical records with clinical detachment. This is a clear case of complicated grief, what we now call prolonged grief disorder. The photograph, rather than providing comfort, became a focus for Mr. Richardson's inability to process his daughter's death. By creating an image that denied the reality of Elizabeth's death, the family inadvertently created a tool that enabled his psychological decline. Amanda found Dorothy Richardson's correspondence with the hospital physicians. In one letter, dated December 1910, she wrote, "My husband speaks to the photograph as though Elizabeth can hear him. He sets a place for her at dinner and claims she's simply away at school. The photograph that was meant to bring him comfort has instead severed his connection to reality. I wish we had never taken it. I wish we had let her rest in peace." Through genealogical research, Amanda located descendants of Michael and Sarah Richardson, the 2 surviving siblings who had been forced to pose beside their deceased sister in 1910. Michael's grandson, Thomas Richardson, lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, and possessed family letters that had never been publicly shared. Amanda and Chen traveled to Charlotte to meet him. Thomas, a retired engineer in his 70s, had complicated feelings about his family's history. He led them to his study and retrieved a box of documents that had belonged to his grandfather. Michael never spoke about this photograph while he was alive, Thomas explained. But late in his life in the 1970s, he wrote down his memories. "I think he needed to finally process what had happened. My father showed me these pages after my grandfather died, and they've haunted our family ever since." He handed Amanda a stack of typed pages. Michael Richardson's testimony, written 60 years after the event, was visceral and heartbreaking. "I was 12 years old when Elizabeth died. I understood death. I had seen it before when my grandmother passed. But what my father made us do 2 days after Elizabeth's funeral was something I have never been able to fully understand or forgive. Dr. Whitmore came to our house early that morning. I watched him work on Elizabeth's body, applying powders and paints, positioning her arms and legs, using some kind of wire frame to hold her upright in the chair. He manipulated her face, pulling the corners of her mouth upward to create that terrible smile. My mother sobbed in the next room. When the photographer arrived, we were told to sit naturally, to act as though everything was normal, but Elizabeth was cold beside me. I could feel it. Sarah, only 8 years old, kept whispering, 'She's not alive, she's not alive,' until my father shouted at her to be quiet. We sat there for half an hour, while the photographer prepared his equipment and took the exposure. The longest half hour of my life, sitting next to my dead sister, who had been arranged to look alive. Thomas Richardson also possessed Sarah Richardson's diary from 1910, a small leather-bound book that she had kept hidden throughout her life. The entries from March were sparse but devastating in their simplicity and honesty. Amanda read them carefully, each brief entry revealing the trauma of an 8-year-old child forced to participate in her father's denial. March 15th. Elizabeth died today. Mama says she is with the angels now. I don't understand why she had to go. March 16th. Papa says we will take a family picture. He says Elizabeth will be in it. Mama's crying all the time. March 17th. Today was the worst day. They made Elizabeth smile, but her eyes were wrong. I had to sit next to her, and Papa said I must not move or cry. I was so scared. Elizabeth was there, but she wasn't there. Michael held my hand very tight. Mama's face looked like a mask. Papa kept saying everything was perfect, but it wasn't perfect. It was terrible. March 20th. I can't sleep. I keep seeing Elizabeth smile. It wasn't her smile. Someone else made her smile. I want to forget, but I can't. March 28th. I heard Mama and Dr. Whitmore talking. Mama wants to destroy the photograph. Papa won't let her. He looks at it every night. He talks to it. I'm afraid of Papa now. The entries continued sporadically through the year, documenting Sarah's increasing anxiety, nightmares, and fear of her father's deteriorating mental state. The final entry about the photograph was dated October 15th, 1910. Papa went to the hospital today. He was screaming that we had hidden Elizabeth from him. He broke things in the house looking for her. I'm glad he's gone. I'm sorry he's sick, but I'm glad he's gone. I never want to see that photograph again. Chen and Amanda's investigation attracted the attention of Dr. Patricia Vance. a medical historian from Johns Hopkins University who specialized in Victorian and Edwardian death practices. She joined their research team, bringing expertise in the cultural and medical contexts that had enabled the Richardson photograph to happen. Together, they discovered that the Richardson case was not unique. Postmortem photography had been common throughout the 19th century, but by 1910, the practice was evolving, or in some cases, devolving, into more disturbing forms. They found at least 15 other documented cases between 1900 and 1915, where deceased individuals, primarily children, had been posed as though alive, rather than peacefully at rest. Dr. Vance located medical journal articles from the 1910s discussing the psychological dangers of such practices. One article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, published in 1912, specifically warned physicians against participating in deceptive post-mortem portraiture that could enable denial and prevent healthy grief processes. They also found evidence that Thomas Hamilton, the photographer, had refused all similar requests after the Richardson portrait. In a letter to a colleague in 1911, he wrote, "I will never again participate in the creation of such images, regardless of the fee offered or the desperation of the bereaved. These photographs do not comfort, they torment. They preserve not memories, but nightmares." Richard Richardson was released from Tucker Pavilion in April 1911, apparently improved but never fully recovered. He returned to his position at the bank, but was described by contemporaries as a changed man, withdrawn and melancholic. He died in 1923 of heart failure at age 51. Dorothy Richardson survived until 1945. Neither Michael nor Sarah ever married or had children. Thomas Richardson was descended from Richard's brother. In October 2024, Amanda Foster presented her findings at a conference on forensic photography and historical death practices at the Smithsonian Institution. The Richardson photograph was displayed, along with a complete documentation of the family's story. The presentation generated significant discussion about ethics, grief, and the role of photography in processing death. Dr. Morrison, the psychiatrist, delivered a companion presentation on the psychological impact of denial-based mourning practices. She emphasized how the photograph, intended to comfort Richard Richardson, had instead become a tool that prevented him from accepting his daughter's death and moving through healthy grief processes. The smile in this photograph is disturbing because it represents a fundamental violation of natural processes, Morrison explained to the audience. Death is difficult to accept, but acceptance is necessary for psychological healing. By creating an image that denied Elizabeth's death, the Richardson family created a permanent artifact of denial, one that traumatized the surviving children and contributed to the father's mental collapse. Following the conference, the Library of Congress, in consultation with the Richardson family descendants, made a difficult decision. The photograph would be preserved in the archives for research purposes, but it would not be publicly displayed or published without significant contextual explanation. Thomas Richardson agreed with this decision. "My grandfather and great-aunt suffered because of what my great-grandfather's grief made them do," Thomas said in a statement. Elizabeth Richardson deserves to be remembered not as the smiling corpse in a disturbing photograph, but as the 10-year-old child who died of scarlet fever in 1910, mourned by her family. The photograph exists as a historical document of how grief can go terribly wrong, but it should not exist as entertainment or curiosity. Amanda stood in her office on the final day of the investigation, looking at the photograph one last time before it was transferred to secure archival storage. Elizabeth Richardson's smile, that unsettling, impossible smile, stared back at her from across 114 years. It was a smile created by manipulation of dead muscles, a smile that had never expressed joy or life, a smile that had haunted a family for generations. The Zoom had explained why the smile seemed off, because it was the smile of death dressed up as life, because it represented a father's desperate denial, a mother's helpless compliance, and the trauma inflicted on two surviving children forced to participate in an act that violated both nature and their own understanding of reality. The photograph remained as evidence, not of a family's love, but of how grief, when unable to accept loss, can create horrors that echo across generations. Elizabeth Richardson had died in 1910, but her forced smile had continued to inflict pain for over a century, until finally her story could be told completely, honestly, and laid to rest.